Hey everybody, welcome to our Sunday online conversation. This is a house church week, so on those weeks we usually record some sort of conversation talking about the sermon series we're currently in. And it's just me today, so this is more a one-way conversation, but hopefully you're responding and thinking as we go through it. A couple weeks ago, I preached on a section of Mark chapter 1. We've been in a series called Life with Jesus, walking through the Gospel of Mark. And we're still in chapter 1, but we have been talking about how this is a very brief and punchy gospel, how perhaps it's the earliest gospel that was written, and how Mark seems to focus not so much maybe on the beginning and ending of the story. We actually don't get much of a resurrection account. We don't get much of a nativity account, but on this concept that was emphasized throughout Jesus's ministry, that Jesus was a king, and also that Jesus was a king unlike any that the people of the time were expecting, especially that idea of a Messiah, a rescuer that God would send to save his people from occupation and from enemies. So in this sermon, we talked about how chapter 1 is full of powerful displays from Jesus. We get exorcisms and miracles, and it's all very fast-paced. But we also find in chapter 1, especially the section that I went through, some differences, some places where Jesus makes decisions that seem to be counter-cultural at the time, but also counter to what we expect and experience in our own lives. So we read through Mark 1 verses 21 through 39, and in those verses we see more miracles. We see a man interrupt Jesus's synagogue sermon and who is possessed by a demon, and Jesus casts out that demon. And he also heals Simon's mother-in-law, Peter's mother-in-law, and the whole town gathers at the door that evening trying to clamor for his attention. And it says Jesus healed many of them from various diseases and drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak. This is verse 34, because they knew who he was. So there's this interesting element in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus often tells demons to be silent and people he's healed to be quiet about who he is, about their healing. And though they often don't listen to him, it seems that this goes beyond the practical. There is a practical element to it. Jesus was protecting a fledgling ministry, but also that he was enforcing this sort of practice of hiddenness, perhaps. And so we read through that section. I would highly encourage you. The book of Mark is very short. You can read through these verses after you get done listening to this, or read through the whole book of Mark even several times as we're going through this series. And we see in verses 35 through 39 a section where Jesus goes away early in the morning to pray and to be with his Father. And we said that Jesus was a human, so he needed this time away from the crowds. He needed this time in solitude before his Father, but he was also God incarnate, and so we believe he was exempling these things to us, his disciples, as well as his disciples at the time, because he knew they would come looking for him and wondering why he wasn't playing into this hype, why he wasn't just using every waking moment to build up the momentum of this ministry. But Jesus instead answers that he wants to go somewhere else. He wants to go to nearby villages to preach the gospel. And that is why he has come, says verse 38. And so we who are his disciples also have to consider what these things, what this strange act of Jesus teaches us, just as it taught the disciples. And I suggested there were 3 temptations in this section throughout Jesus's ministry too, that he confronted here with practices or spiritual rhythms, and that these were an example both to his disciples at the time and to us today. And the 3 temptations are the temptation of hurry, the temptation of people pleasing, and the temptation of notoriety. So the first one was the temptation of hurry. And instead of just summarizing everything from this sermon, I just thought I would ask you guys to think through some questions related to each of these temptations. So for the temptation of hurry, I think we all know what hurry is, but how do we tell if we are hurried people with a culture that is nonstop? We may feel like we're pretty chill, right? But how do we actually tell if we are very, very hurried? I think one of the ways we tell is how we are with others. How we are with others. How do others experience us? This might be a question you could ask somebody who will be honest with you, a close friend, a spouse, a family member. How do you experience me? Patient, impatient, hurried, unhurried? How do you listen to people? Are you kind of jumping in, finishing sentences? Are you obviously preparing a response before they've had a chance to get everything out? Are you glancing at your watch or your cell phone? Are you trying to get to the next task, or are you unhurried and relaxed with people in conversation or in other instances? Another question we could ask is, how do we perform tasks? How do we do the things that we do on a daily basis? And you could think about work here, but I'm thinking about mundane things like driving, like shopping. How do we act on the road when somebody is going slow? How do we act in the grocery store when there's an older person who's got in front of us, kind of walking at a snail's pace, taking up a lot of room? Is our first reaction to clench up and just try to figure out how to get around them? Is it to get angry at that person on the road? Or are we okay and relaxed enough to let go of those things that seem so pressing and realize that we don't have to live a life of hurry? And then finally, how are you in God's presence? Is it kind of like this breathless, the disciples went and found Jesus and they're kind of breathless, asking him, "Where have you been?" Is it sort of a breathless arrival where we're just thinking, "Oh, I got to remember everything on my prayer list. Here's all the things I wanted to say to you, God"? Or can we just sit in God's presence and accept and feel his love for us before we launch into our list of prayer requests? So hopefully these aren't discouraging questions, and I just want to assure you that my answers to a lot of these are, yeah, I am a hurried person. I think people experience me as hurried in especially some different areas. So what is the practice that we can confront this with? I think Jesus shows us that we can confront this with solitude, that we need to spend time alone with our phones off, detached from the task list. And that might be really hard, but Jesus had to plan for it too. He had to sneak away. He had a whole group that followed him everywhere he went. He had to make the time for it. He had to find the place. He had to get there and be alone. And I think if we don't do this, we're going to miss out on so much. I mean, just imagine it. If you're on your deathbed, looking back on your life, is it going to be how many tasks you got checked off the list? Or is it going to be those long conversations you were able to have with a friend, that time you were able to really encourage somebody, the time you took to treat others well, that is going to really stick with you? Small choices. I think this can start with small choices. You'll be surprised how much 10 minutes a day in solitude with God, just resting in his love, will change your outlook for the entire day. I guarantee you. If you don't believe me, start this week. Just do it for a week and see what happens. I know that God's going to meet you in that. The second temptation is the temptation of people pleasing. This one hits home for me, and maybe not so much for other people. You might be somebody who doesn't really care at all what other people think, or you don't think you do. But there may be one or two people that you do aim to please, that you would change your decisions for, that you would act a different way around. So here's some questions. Do you try to make everyone around you happy? Do you feel the pressure to make everyone happy? If your decision got in the way of somebody else being okay, but it was what you thought you were supposed to do, would that really be a hardship for you? Can you have healthy boundaries? Do you have healthy boundaries with people? Do you feel like if somebody's really bummed about something and you weren't, that it's okay to just, yeah, of course, be sympathetic, but you don't have to be dragged into those same emotions? Do you feel like you can make decisions wisely without worrying about getting everyone's opinion, without worrying about doing the thing that everyone else wants you to do? Are you worried a lot about disappointing people? Does it constantly play in your head the what ifs? If you do this, who is going to be mad or who is going to be disappointed? Are you able to let that go pretty easily, even if you experience that worry at first? I think Jesus had a lot of people around him he could have tried to please, but that wasn't the aim or goal of his ministry. We see even in this, he says, let's go to another village. We don't have to be here. It's okay. We can go to another place. And that wasn't living up to his disciples' expectations. It certainly wasn't living up to the expectations of the crowds. They would have to go after him in order to be a part of this good news. But that's what we had to do too as disciples. We have to make this a priority by reorganizing our time so we can seek the will of the Father. So I said we confront this with the practice of prayer. That spending time in sincere prayer for others, asking God for his wisdom, which James says he gives freely to those who ask, is one of the most important things we can do. And I challenge people, if you're going to do 10 minutes of solitude, why not finish that up with 5 minutes of prayer? That's 15 minutes of your day that you're spending seeking the will of the Father. And the last temptation was the temptation of notoriety. Now, a lot of us don't have crazy social media platforms. We're not looking to become the next influencer or anything like that. So this one might sound a bit like it's not in your wheelhouse. It doesn't bother you. You are not tempted by it at all. But maybe if we thought of it more as the temptation to save face, to appear a certain way, to be perceived a certain way, rather than honestly and vulnerably, maybe that would hit home a little more. It does for me. I don't have a social media platform. I'm not worried about that. But it is a temptation to appear a certain way, to appear intelligent, to appear like I have my life together. So it's a temptation to appear a certain way. And that might be you changing how you act or speak in front of people. It might be that you don't share honestly when people try to engage you in conversation. You avoid vulnerability. You keep conversation very surface level. It may be that you don't ever share honestly when you're going through something hard. And you might do this on social media. That might be a place where you do this, where it kind of encourages us just to post the highlights. And you don't have to post the lowlights, but you should for sure be talking to somebody about them, right? So I said the practice to avoid this is hiddenness. And I think that's true. These acts of hidden generosity, these times where we don't feel like we need to save face, but also, and I was thinking about this going over the notes again, I think the practice just of honesty, of integrity, of being the same person with everyone and being the same person that you are experiencing yourself as on the inside. And maybe that's a depressed person. Maybe that's a person who's really having a hard time in your relationship with God. Maybe that's a person who's been going through a lot and has questions. Practicing that honesty, especially in the community of the church, should be something that the disciples of Jesus can do. And here's the thing, unless one person does it, chances are a whole group of people will remain very surface level. because they will be afraid to share honestly until somebody else does. So ask yourself, how are you really feeling? How are you really feeling? Maybe you need to sit with that a little while. Scan yourself for what emotions you're feeling in this moment. And then how can you share those feelings with somebody today? How could you share this honestly with your church community? Just to receive support and a listening ear, and maybe not solutions, but something that you can feel encouraged by. So set aside your time for these practices, for solitude and prayer, hiddenness and honesty, but have those conversations too. That's what the church is here for. It can't end with a you and Jesus moment. It involves everyone in your church community. And keep going. If you start small and build up these practices, I know that they will have a great impact on your life. We're excited to continue going through the book of Mark next week, so you could join us for corporate service on the 14th of October. We would love to see you there, 6 p.m. at the North Rock building.